Hello, everyone. My name is Sam Brinton, and I'm really excited to welcome you to our presentation, The Good Fruit Project, Making the Mental Health and Spiritual Case for Ending LGBTQ Conversion Therapy. I'm joined in this presentation by my colleague, Casey Pick. Casey, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Casey Pick. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the Senior Fellow for Advocacy and Government Affairs at the Trevor Project. I also had the good fortune of kind of leading Trevor's half of the Good Fruit Project initiative.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Casey. Really glad to have you here with us. As I said, my name is Sam Brinton. I use they and them as my pronouns, and I serve as our VP of Advocacy and Government Affairs at the Trevor Project. You may be wondering, which is a totally good thing to wonder, what is the Trevor Project? Well, we are the world's largest suicide prevention and crisis intervention program for LGBTQ young people. We've been around for more than 20 years and answer nearly 200,000 crisis contacts each and every year. But why do we exist? That's another good question. We are here to make sure that LGBTQ youth know that they are not alone. This is a common problem that I think a lot of us at QCF have experienced before, this feeling of isolation, this feeling of loneliness. And that can lead to, and be one of the major factors that leads to LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ adults having higher risk of suicide. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people. And that is why we work each and every day to make sure that we all know what the warning signs of suicide are and do everything in our power to reduce the risk. LGBTQ youth, as I already said, are more at risk. Actually, it's 4 to 5 times as likely to attempt suicide as potentially heterosexual youth. And if you are a trans individual like myself, up to 50% of all trans people have made this suicide attempt, and most of them before the age of 25. So again, these young people that we are trying to serve. There is hope, though. I know these are some hard stats, and it's never easy to start with the harsh reality, but the really good news, and the reason that Casey and I do this work each and every day, is we know that just one accepting person can reduce that risk of suicide by more than 40%. So you hopefully will get to be that person in someone's life, and we are so excited that you do. But in case you need support in this work, that's why the Trevor Project has a variety of crisis services. These come in a lot of different ways. So to my good old folks who love the phone, 866-488-7386. You can call us 24/7, 365, and we will always be there. Our lifeline is ready to serve LGBTQ youth no matter where they are across the country. It is currently a US-based system, so just something to note. But let's say you're like me and using a cell phone and actually talking on the phone seems kind of foreign. Well, don't worry. Text START, START, to the number 678-678, and you'll get that same exact lifeline service just over text. So don't worry if your parents are only a door away because you had to be with them in the age of COVID. You get to have a private conversation with someone who could help save your life. We also need to remember that socioeconomically, not everyone has a cell phone. And so access via computers can be another way for people to reach the Trevor Project. So again, if you have people in your life who need to figure out how to access Trevor Project, you can always send them to thetrevorproject.org/help. That's again, thetrevorproject.org/help. That will lead you to all 3 of these really important life-saving services. Again, they are free, they're confidential, and you're able to always access them. And you're able to access them for the people in your life who need it. That's a really important thing for us to remember, that supportive adult means that we also know the resources and can get people to them. So now you know another resource. There's a lot of text here. The important thing for you to remember is that it is not just our crisis services at the Trevor Project. We do a lot of things. Trevor Space is like MySpace, for those of you who remember MySpace, or Facebook, but a safe place specifically built for LGBTQ youth. Yes, Hundreds of thousands of LGBTQ youth from all over the world talk to each other about what it's like to get invited to prom and show off their cool art and talk about an accepting church, which Casey's going to tell us all about how powerful that moment can be. We also have research. We are going to have survey data that shows that conversion therapy and a variety of other risk factors increase the risk of suicide. And we know that because of this Trevor research. We also, what Casey and I do each and every day, we advocate, whether it be federal, state, or local, or working in, for or against bills, we make sure that LGBTQ youth have the opportunity, just like every other young person, to live a happy and productive life. We do this through our education as well, which is what we're doing right now. We're educating. Our job is to try to bring a little bit of more knowledge into this world as well. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty and why we're all here. We are going to speak specifically about conversion therapy and the impact that it has on LGBTQ young people. But you may be first asking, what is conversion therapy? It's a good question again. It's so many different ways to say the same harmful, dangerous, and discredited practice. You may have heard reparative therapy. You may have heard ex-gay ministries. If you're reading and research, you may have heard of sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts, or SOGC. But no matter how you call it, it is this awful idea that you can change a person from LGBTQ young, happy individual into a straight or cisgender individual. Let's bring a little science into it. My background, I didn't give a lot of it, is I used to be a nuclear physicist, thus the paintings on my wall. And in science, we do understand that things that are harmful need to stop. We don't want to keep doing harmful things. And every single professional, the major American medical associations and others have said, it's harmful and it doesn't work. That's really important for us. It's also important for us to recognize that this harm is kind of proven each and every week when people call the Trevor Project after having just been through conversion therapy or the risk of conversion therapy. These experiences are not happy experiences. They're calling the Trevor Project in crisis. And that is what leads Casey and I to do the work to make sure that conversion therapy ends up in the dustbins of history, because it's not just ineffective, it's actively harmful. And that's why we're here to talk about. I love this slide. It's like one of my favorites. So if you deal with the brain and you deal with children, you have come to the conclusion that conversion therapy has no place in this world. I think that's a really important thing for us to just kind of breathe in and understand. We as people of faith understand that we want to learn and grow together and understand more, right? We learn context. We grow deeper in our understanding. Those who have grown very deep in their understanding of mental health understand that conversion therapy is bad for your mental health. I think that's just really important for us to remember as we move into the faith aspects. It's important to remember this is not good science. This is not good practice. So what are we doing about it? It's not okay to just say it's bad. Let's do something about it, shall we? Well, I'm really proud to say that in just the past few years, 20 states have passed laws protecting minors from conversion therapy, from receiving this conversion therapy, by a licensed professional. That's huge. I cannot emphasize that the time it took for marriage and the time it takes for non-discrimination and the time it is taking for these big LGBT movements is being condensed into a matter of years when it comes to conversion therapy, because people just like you are understanding we cannot actively harm those we are trying to help. And it's not just bills passing, it's also bills starting. 19 other states bring us to 49. Oh, counting, math is hard. 39 states have worked now actively to end conversion therapy, and federal support is growing each day. I would be very remiss, though, if I just talked about the laws in states. people like Casey and others are working each and every day to make sure that the courtroom is also a place where conversion therapy is on notice. This is an actively harmful practice that is, again, stealing money from well-meaning parents. So let's make sure that these laws are defended in court and that survivors like myself are told that it is not okay to go through what we went through and that it should never happen to another person. I said briefly that I was a survivor. Telling our stories has been a really powerful way for us to influence those around us. So you may see movies like Boy Erased and Miseducation of Cameron Post. You may see pop culture moments while people actively talk about conversion therapy being harmful. And you're, of course, going to hear from survivors, just like the Unchanged movement, which we'll hear about in a little bit, who are using their stories to make this type of political change. It's really quite powerful. It's always important to have a graphic. So here are those states that I talked about. Notice that some of the states in orange, which are the states which have protected minors from conversion therapy, are not the states you may be thinking of. Utah, Virginia were just our latest in this awesome movement working to end conversion therapy. And it is important for us to remember that ending conversion therapy no political party. Republicans and Democrats alike have understood, as we all have now, that this is actively harmful and we need to be stopping it. And those yellow states, the states like Idaho and Georgia, are every year submitting legislation, making sure that people know, not in my backyard. Let's make sure that conversion therapy stops. Now, you see some states in gray. We still have our work cut out for us. And each and every year, we will work to make sure that more states join the movement. You also see all these cities. These cities are represented in this image by those orange circles. Those orange circles are really important. They're telling LGBTQ youth in states where we may not have a law in place, guess what? We're fighting for you too. Here and everywhere, we want to make sure that there is a place for you. And of course, there are resolutions and executive orders and regulations. Believe me, if there is a way for us to end conversion therapy, we are using all of those levers. We want to learn from you, though. If you think that, as we get to the end of this presentation, that you have another way that we could end conversion therapy, or you want to get involved in these bills, reach out to us. We'll have our email addresses, and we're always open with ears, trying to make sure that we can end this type of harm. I'll end my slide and move us into our next project with a really important transition. It's not just about the court, and it's not just about the law. These laws are all about a professional, making sure that the person sitting across from you, giving you a mental health care, does so appropriately and not with the dangerous and discredited practice of conversion therapy. However, we know this. There's a lot of people practicing conversion therapy that are not licensed. And we have, up to this point, not had a lot of ways to stop them because the state can't intercede in a lot of different forms. However, we know we needed to do more. And that's where I'm going to turn it over to Casey for just how we did more. So Casey, take it away. And you just tell me, and I'll slide us to the next slide.
Sure, let's stick on this slide for just a minute.
Sure.
I just want to say hello to everybody who's out there, and thank you for allowing Trevor Project to once again be part of this exciting conference. This is far from Sam and Mai's first time here. We love being part of Q Christian Fellowship and speaking to this unique audience and organization. And that's also where I want to throw in just a little bit of an apology to some folks who may have come to our session last year, because they might find some of Sam's slides to be a little bit familiar. But there's a good reason for that. One, we always want to get the message out to anybody who's new in the room. But secondly, what I'm about to talk about, what we call the Good Fruit Project, actively grew out of conversations that we had at last year's conference. So last year we gave a much more in-depth version of the presentation Sam just gave, and we heard from you that while many members of QCF and your communities were excited by the work that we're doing legislatively and in the courts, there was a desire for something more and something specific to your faith communities. And So that's why we got together with the staff of Q Christian Fellowship in the months following conference and started to discuss how are we going to meet that need? How are we going to address the problem of faith-based conversion therapy that is not directly affected by the laws we're passing? Although I would note, as I did last year, that even the laws that we're passing, even though they don't directly regulate somebody like an Exodus International ministry, they do have an effect on them. Because we find out every time, and they even say it in court, that when we ban licensed professionals from performing conversion therapy on minors, it makes it harder for the religious ministries to do their form of conversion therapy, and it makes it harder for licensed professionals to work with adults. They find themselves suddenly having to be very explicit in saying they don't work with minors, in getting informed consent, in raising up the potential harms. And every time that change happens, it reduces suffering in the world, and that makes me happy. But we knew we can do more. So here's what we did. Sam, next slide. We've been talking to you about the Trevor Project's initiative, 50 Bills, 50 States. And I know the QCF has done a tremendous job promoting the work they've done by collecting the stories of conversion therapy survivors and others who have been negatively affected by conversion therapy through the Unchanged initiative. We took these two, our expertise, everything we've learned, everything we've discovered in all of our stories, and we combined them into what we're calling the Good Fruit Project. Sam, next slide. First off, a little bit about this partnership. And for this purpose, I'm going to quote directly from the Good Fruit Guide, just because I love the language. It's our introduction to communities that may not have heard of either of our organizations and needs to know about what resources we bring to the table, who we are, and why we're here. So what we say is we say that Q Christian Fellowship is a Christian nonprofit dedicated to pursuing a world where all LGBTQ people are fully loved by family, church, and community. The Trevor Project is a secular, research-driven organization that is on a mission to end suicide among LGBTQ youth. However different, the two organizations are united in our common experience of serving LGBTQ people who have been profoundly affected and all too often deeply wounded by the experience of conversion therapy in a Christian context. The Good Fruit Project represents our effort to bring together our different perspectives. Q Christians speaking to theology, with Trevor bringing our experience supporting LGBTQ mental health, in the hope of creating something that will empower our various communities to better understand each other, and, God willing, may ultimately save lives. Next slide. All of that said, we now get into specifically what is the Good Fruit Project. It's actually at least 4 different things. Right now, it exists as a website. You can find it at www.goodfruitproject.com. And there you will find, first, the guide, an actual document that makes a Christian case against LGBTQ change efforts, how we chose to describe conversion therapy for these purposes. You'll also find discussion materials. We've already created a discussion guide that I will talk more about later, but can be used in a variety of settings, from Bible studies to seminary classes. You'll find something we're calling the Good Fruit Pledge, and you'll find an abundant list of additional resources so that somebody who has put their toe in the water to understand the harms of conversion therapy in Christian communities can go and find abundant more information, ranging from the Trevor Project's ally guides on how to be, say, a better ally to trans and non-binary youth, to Q Christians' resources on creating a more accepting church and what does it mean to be welcoming or affirming. And also just abundant stories of survivors themselves. There's so much there, and I hope that you'll take the time to check it out. So before I get more into what's actually in the guide, I want to talk a little bit about the process of its creation. As I've mentioned, this was something that came together after our conference last year when we were in continued conversations with QCF staff about what we could do next. They actually, your fantastic QCF staff came to us with an original proposal and draft which has undergone a lot of evolution ever since. The first draft was fantastic, but this was a long road. We went through many drafts, dozens of reviewers to look over the content and add their perspectives. Pastors, survivors, lawyers, therapists, members of many denominations, so that we could try and make this the most helpful and broad-reaching guide that we could. And what you'll find in this, unlike any other resource I've seen regarding conversion therapy, is a greater focus on religious forms of conversion therapy, including talking about especially the terms used, naming names of some key religious conversion therapy organizations and promoters. And you'll find a document that is really designed to be accessible to the audiences we really want to see this. It is written in plain speech. It includes an extensive glossary, and you don't need to be a seminarian. You don't need to be fluent in LGBTQ and the entire alphabet soup. It is a document that is really geared towards folks who may be considering conversion therapy as what they think to be a loving option. So the folks who we really think need to hear it, we're not preaching to the choir here. So, what's in the guide? The guide itself is a free resource that is designed to facilitate conversation about the fruit that is born, the bad fruit of conversion therapy and ex-gay narratives, and really targeted towards faith communities, particularly Christian communities. You'll find, given the title, that it, thanks to our friends at QCF, presents a accessible, authentic, and loving theological argument rooted in Matthew 7, the idea that every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. And you'll see that paired with the evidence of bad fruit that is the Trevor Project's research, and also research by other organizations, those professional organizations that Sam listed earlier, groups that have been doing this work for a long, long time. You'll see the most recent statistics and scientific evidence paired directly with powerful testimony from survivors and people who have been negatively affected by faith-based conversion therapy efforts. You're going to see some familiar faces, QCF. You'll see members, people who have submitted their stories to the Unchanged Initiative, and great folks like Darren Calhoun, Danny Cortez, and so many more. And you'll also see something I've never seen published all in one place this way before, ways of identifying conversion therapy happening in your faith community and what you can do to stop it. Sam and I have been doing this work in the legislative sphere for a long time. So part of what we've done is we've really mastered the art of explaining licensed professionals. What does that look like? Protecting minors. What does that look like? Sometimes almost to the expense of being able to talk about conversion therapy in a faith context, because we don't want to confuse lawmakers. We don't want them worrying about, well, what does this do to the First Amendment when the laws they're talking about have nothing to do with it. But this document really is about putting those issues in focus. And so finally giving us the opportunity to speak to some of the data that we have that is specific to religious conversion therapy, how often it happens, who's doing it. And this also lets us get into really unique terms. So some of the things that are unique to Christian conversion therapy is the way it's described. You'll hear it, these practitioners never call it conversion therapy anymore. They know that we've identified that term, that we've practically copyrighted it and got that well understood. People know what that means. So now they come up with new ways of talking about it. And I'm sorry if any of these phrases are triggering or hard to hear. So consider yourself warned, folks. But we call out the phrases healing sexual brokenness, embracing your true identity in Christ, sexual attraction, fluidity, exploration, and therapy is their pseudoscientific term for it. We're able to raise up the fact that the 2009 working group by the American Psychological Association, that condemned conversion therapy as harmful and ineffective, that working group actually included a professor at Regent University, a well-known, very conservative Christian college named Mark Yarhouse. I would never feel the need to mention that in testimony to the Virginia legislature, but it's valuable to have here because maybe hearing Regent University Somebody from Regent condemns conversion therapy will be the thing that'll keep a parent from sending their kid to conversion therapy. We talk about the rise and fall of Exodus International, something that Q Christian Fellowship, previously known as Gay Christian Network, was intimately involved with. And we talk also about how there are new faith-based organizations that are rising up. We think about Changed and Bethel Church that are taking on that mantle. And we specifically address some of the arguments they make about gender identity and targeting transgender youth in a way that is accessible to Christian audiences. And finally, the Good Fruit Project confronts readers with a clear challenge from Scripture, saying that if something bears blatantly bad fruit on earth, as seen with conversion therapy, it should be questioned and, if necessary, rejected, repented of, and opposed. That's not language I get to use in a court of law, but it is language that matters, and invoking Scripture that way matters to our audience. Next slide, Tim. So now just a little bit of like, what does this look like? This is just a screenshot from one of the page in the guide of what I want to talk about next, which is some of the facts and figures that we are raising up. But I wanted you to have a sense of what it looks like if you haven't had a chance to go to goodfruitproject.com and actually download the guide yet. So this does raise up Trevor's direct experience with hearing from youth in crisis, paired with peer-reviewed research and national studies of tens of thousands of youth, showing the dramatic physical and mental harms, including depression, anxiety, loss of income, and increased rates of suicidality. We talk about how conversion therapy has divided families, broken relationships, and driven LGBTQ youth out of their faith communities. And all of that in just 20 short pages. 20 pages including the covers, graphics, survivor photos, a glossary and resources section, and artwork. It's a dense document, but there's a lot in there, but we also tried to keep it pretty. Next slide, Sam. Since we're the Trevor Project, I want to call out some of the religion and conversion therapy data we were able to feature here. As I said, in 2020, Trevor Project surveyed more than 40,000 LGBTQ youth about topics related to their mental health. 6 out of 10 had experienced somebody, a parent, pastor, friend, or somebody else, trying to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. 14% told us that a religious leader had attempted to convince them to change. And when we get into actually asking, do you think you went through conversion therapy? Is that the label you would put on your experience? 10% of those 40,000 told us they'd experienced conversion therapy in some form. 6% of the total said it came from their pastor or priest, 5% from another religious leader or counselor. Left off on this slide, because we're not talking as much about mental health professionals, 3 to 4% came from licensed professionals. Obviously, 6 plus 5 plus 3 to 4 adds up to more than 10. I'm sure that the survivors watching now understand that frequently people go to a variety of different sources, and there's an overlap here. All of it totals out to the reality that LGBTQ youth who had undergone conversion therapy were more than twice as likely to have attempted suicide in the previous 12 months. That's bad fruit. That's the harm that we really want to show folks, and we want them to come away with knowing that's what conversion therapy does. Next slide. And part of how we did that was by telling stories. We don't want this to just be a document of statistics. We don't want it to just be a document of theology. We want this to be about people, and we want this to be real. So we set it up so that anybody who reads this document is looking into the faces of people who have experienced conversion therapy. As I mentioned, you see some familiar faces here. You're the QCF board member, Paula Stone-Williams, providing a trans perspective on this. Ralph Jones tells a lovely and powerful story about his experience and making sure that we make it visible that conversion therapy is not just an issue that affects white gay men, as is a stereotype. We know from our research that the communities that conversion therapy affects, communities of color actually showed up disproportionately high in our research as reporting conversion therapy. Other communities that showed up as being disproportionately high in reporting conversion therapy, transgender and non-binary youth, youth in the South, and also youth who reported hearing their parents say negative things about LGBTQ people based on their religion or faith. And of course, in the middle, you see Rev. Danny Cortez, not a survivor himself, but as a pastor who historically, when he was part of the Southern Baptist Church, recommended conversion therapy and now regrets that. His story, we think, will be particularly powerful. One thing I do love, and this is a chance for me to give a shout out to the creative folks, QCF's Nathaniel and Trevor's creative team, is that there's actually a page where you see the stories of survivors in living, vibrant color in the text. And that is juxtaposed on one page to the truly harmful words of the American Association of Christian Counselors Code of Ethics that endorses conversion therapy, which is in stark black and white. And I think even on that subconscious level, we're really sending a message about what it takes to be life-giving. Next slide. But as I said, it's not just the guide itself that we are putting out into the world and hoping to see shared and really get some work. We've also created a discussion guide. You see here, that's another screenshot of the document itself. There are actually 10 questions on it that range from, why do you think people seek out change efforts? And what's a more loving, safer way to address their concerns? To, what do you think about the use of various different scriptures that we quote in the document? And encouraging folks to really connect their faith experiences and beliefs to the harms that they are learning about in conversion therapy. We would love to see this show up and being used in Bible studies, small groups, seminary classes, and more. And I particularly speak now to, say, pastors and young seminarians who are thinking about, maybe I'm accepting and affirming, but maybe my church community hasn't gotten there yet. Maybe they haven't had this conversation, or they're not comfortable with starting the conversation with something like marriage. I would encourage you to contemplate using this as a first step down that road to really exploring what it means to be a safe and welcoming place for LGBTQ people in your congregation. Next slide. And finally, the last major component of the Good Fruit Project is the pledge. We did not want to put a document out into the world and just have it end there. We wanted to include some kind of call to action. And specifically, we drafted what we're calling the Good Fruit Pledge. On the website, www.goodfruitproject.com, I'm going to keep saying it, you find an opportunity to actually sign this pledge. And through that, commit yourself to creating a safer space. I'm actually going to read out what the pledge says so folks know what we're asking people to commit to here. And maybe you'll consider going forth and signing it, or using this as something to ask your pastors to sign to. We say in this pledge, Christians are called to love and care for our neighbors, including those who are LGBTQ. Recognizing that conversion therapy and other change efforts bear bad fruit, I will commit to respecting the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health of LGBTQ siblings by refraining from trying to change their sexual orientation or gender identity through my words, deeds, ministries, and policies. And I will actively encourage my faith community to do the same. On the one hand, it may not seem like much of an ask. It may seem like we're putting the bar low. But on the other hand, I can imagine many, many churches where a pastor deciding that they want to commit themselves to these words would make a dramatic difference. And that would go a long way towards reducing the number of youth who are subjected to some kind of change effort. So this is not intended to be the end of the road, but we do hope that it is the start of a journey for many people. Next slide. Now, we actually introduced this project in mid-December. We did a soft launch before the holidays. So if you haven't heard about it, don't worry, you will. And we are doing a lot of work on getting it out there. But even that soft launch that we put out there has gotten some really nice pickup in interest from a wide range of people, and we're already hearing back. What you see here are some of my favorite screen caps. You've got a news article from the Baptist News speaking about the Good Fruit Project, which happened to come out around the same time as an international statement by religious leaders opposing conversion therapy. You see folks like Brian McLaren, best-selling author and with a fair amount of influence in Christian communities, happily sharing the project and starting a dialogue with his social media followers. You see advocates and civil rights groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center. So this is something that is transcending and getting outside of the exclusively Christian community, because we know that this kind of argument is significant and important. And you even see conservatives like Margaret Hoover, who is a CNN correspondent and regularly appears on CNN news shows talking this up. A little bit about some hard numbers. We're a data group. We have already seen more than 6,000 people hit the website, more coming up on 10,000 total page views, coming up on 1,000 downloads of the guide itself. And also the pledge itself has already been signed by well over 100 people, including dozens of people who are pastors, or at least they're signing themselves using Rev or Bishop or some kind of title that way. I'm doing a little more research every day. But the nice thing about it, and while I'm not going to make any news yet about who's on that list, there are some significant names. That said, what excites me most is not necessarily what we're seeing happen in public. I love seeing the social media and the public promotions of the guide, and I really want to see more of it. But what's exciting me is what I'm hearing going on behind the scenes. Next slide, Sam. I've already heard back that the Good Fruit Project is being shared through networks of churches and pastors. I've heard about people wanting to discuss it or use it in their seminary classes. Really exciting to me, especially after what we saw a few years ago within our varsity, is that current and former InterVarsity and crew staff are passing it around to staff members to protect those youth on college campuses. And specifically, I'm working hard to get it into Christian colleges and universities. So that's where it's going now and where we've heard from it. I also know that in the advocacy communities, there's a large amount of excitement. The leaders of those various states that Sam showed you on the map, where we don't have laws yet protecting us, but we're fighting for laws now, places like Arizona and Oklahoma, their state equality group leaders are coming back saying, thank you, we needed this. We needed something to make this case. PFLAG chapters are also distributing this around and having it there for their Christian parents who are walking into PFLAG space, considering it as an alternative and just stepping into the world of being more accepting. So having something that comes from an authentic voice that speaks Christian to Christian in a lot of ways is powerful and effective. So we've also been partnering with documentaries. You may be hearing about various different documentaries coming out in the near future that are speaking to this. And there are still films out there like Boy Erased, where it has long been frustrating to Sam and I when somebody points out accurately that the conversion therapy we see in a film like Boy Erased would not have been prohibited by the laws we're passing. But maybe if Gerard Conley's mother had read our document first, he would have had a different experience. And that's what we're hoping for. And Gerard was another one who shared out about this document, and I was very excited to see it. So that's what we've done. But the thing is, we know that there's no better audience than Q Christian Fellowships to brainstorm and come up with new ways and new places that we can plant the seed of truly good fruit. So I'm going to open this up and say, where do you want to plant the seeds? What more should we do? And what do you want to see next? This is only the first of this kind of guide that we're going to put out there. Spoiler alert, we've got more coming.
I love that. Spoiler alert, there's more coming. Always more. I love that. That's great. So I'm going to move us to our last slide. So folks, I'm going to take us off of slides here in a little bit. But first off, I want to make sure you saw our email addresses. Now I'm going to try to look a little bit into the Q&A and see what people are chatting about. I can't do that while I'm doing it. Okay, I will put our email address is into the chat. That'll another space, or you can always reach out to Casey and I via the Whova app for the conference as well. Okay, so I'll stop sharing.
Sure. I'm able to look at the chats that we've got down at the bottom, Sam. And great. The first one, question from Sue Bonner, I'll take because it's right in my wheelhouse. Is it possible to do a lawsuit against conversion therapy groups? Since it does harm, it seems to me to be a basis for a suit. The answer to that question is indeed yes, you can. We have seen success even against religious conversion therapy groups performing on adults. The way to do it is to bring a fraud claim. So to demonstrate that the organization made a promise they could not keep. They promised you that, you give them money, they will change you or your child in the case of somebody being subjected by a parent. The thing about that is it is difficult. Our litigation system is hard. It's a hard road, and having to go into court, testify, be cross-examined is not something that a lot of survivors want to do, given traumatic experience. But it is absolutely something that you can do, and I strongly recommend that if that's a path you want to explore going down, reach out to the National Center for Lesbian Rights, nclrights.org. They will get you set up and they will talk to you about what that path would look like. And I would love to see more of these organizations soon, to be quite honest.
Amen to that. We all would. I see the next question is, I'm curious about if there is any justice for people who experienced emotional and spiritual abuse in conversion therapy, because it's really hard to prove the damage done from a legal perspective. Recognizing that legal proof can be really difficult, I think one of the ways we can create justice in this work is to call it out. Like let's recognize if a person doesn't want to be talking about their experiences, they shouldn't have to be doing it. But we can call a movement, this movement of harm that is being done against our community out and say, in part, our justice will be when a generation grows up thinking that conversion therapy and knowing that conversion therapy has no place in modern society. The problem right now is a lot of people don't think that conversion therapy is still happening. And that silencing effect creates injustice because it allows conversion therapy to keep happening. So yes, from a legal perspective, you should absolutely be speaking with NCL, National Center for Lesbian Rights, and others. But it's really important for us to remember that some of this justice is going to be in the church pew. It's going to be about naming harm. It's going to be about creating resources and support systems for those who've gone through harm. So I think one of my favorite parts about QCF conference that I really miss having this year is the ability to just sit and grab a coffee with another survivor. And we don't have to talk about all of our experiences, but knowing that someone else went through it makes me feel a little bit less alone. And so those types of resources, creating spaces like the Unchanged movement to say, hey, you're not alone in this experience. We're going to work to make sure it stops. And we need to recognize that it has harmed you. It doesn't mean that we're broken. It doesn't mean that we're unable to do great things. But it's really important for us to remember that harm is also real. I think Casey actually helps me with this sometimes of, it's been a really hard day. Maybe it's not time for me to tell my story, right? It's not time for me to have to relive that trauma, because instead it can be it's not about the legal work about it. It's about the education. Let's make sure people know those stats that we raised earlier of its harms. That's more sometimes important than reliving a trauma experience, because that's not just. Casey, anything else you want to add?
Just that I would, again, we know that there's the fraud avenue if you know that the person who put you through that is unlicensed. But it is worth looking at and consider, did this person have a license? There are a lot of pastors who are dual licensed who will sometimes sneakily wind up actually acting as a licensed professional, using the authority of their degree and of their license. They wear dual hats. So if that's the case, consider filing a complaint with your state's Board of Licensure. And that, I think you can even do that in a state where we haven't passed explicit laws condemning conversion therapy. Any state where there's a licensed person performing conversion therapy, that is unethical. They are doing something that is shown to be harmful, that is shown to be ineffective, and that is acting outside of their license. So if what you are seeking is justice, then keep pushing, and some form of justice ye shall have.
Amen.
I love Q Christian Fellowship. I actually get to say this stuff.
Why don't you take the next question, Casey?
Sure. Let's see. What would I say to somebody who has survived religious efforts to change their sexuality, but feels like conversion therapy is too strong a term to use for their experience? I would say, first of all, you are entirely legitimate, and that your feelings and your experiences and your hurt from that change attempt are real and valid. I would say that this is a guide that is meant to address what you experienced. There's a reason why we entitled it LGBTQ change efforts. And part of it is just because we know there's an element of not wanting to say or not knowing if you can claim to be a conversion therapy survivor. That feels like a big thing to claim, and you don't want, any kind of stolen valor situation. I feel it sometimes too. I have testified before various different state committees and legislative bodies, and I've talked about my own story of never having undergone conversion therapy, but having been harmed by conversion therapy ideas. In my story, and again, I warned for possible triggering on this, is that I was 13 and I went online and found a conversion therapist website and chat group that recommended snapping a rubber band against your wrist anytime you had a gay thought. And I adopted that for a time. I was an athlete. At the time, it was trendy to do the similar rubber band snap for anytime you missed a free throw in basketball. And so I was able to get away with wearing rubber bands with nobody thinking about it too much. Obviously, it didn't work. It did not change my orientation, but it did hurt physically and mentally. And so while I don't consider myself a conversion therapy survivor, I can tell a story of having been harmed by the idea that my sexual orientation should change. So I would say that, first off, if that's your experience, I'm sorry. I hate that that happened for you. That your experience is real, and whatever story you want to tell about it, that is valid and important. And I hope that this guide prevents things like that happening to people in the future.
I love that answer. That's really great. I do see a question really quickly about resources being in languages other than English. I can say that it is not currently, but we hope to have a variety of types of resources like this in a variety of languages. I know that that's really important. And believe me, Casey and I understand its importance as well. Working on it. Getting this project out was a great labor of love, and we're really looking forward to the next phase. The next big question that I'm also seeing is, was part of this project looking through the language that different religious conversion therapy programs use and finding the common language? Just to pull back before, because Casey knows this language really well, to pull back into the previous question, this is the exact challenge. People call it different things, and that is because there is no scientific consensus. If you had one word that could actually describe something, when I describe a color or the idea of gravity, science understands what gravity is and relates to it, gives it different terms, but mostly understands what that means. When you use different terms in conversion therapy, it's because everyone's going down their own path, because there is no sanctioned and prescribed path, because it's not a credible practice. So Casey, I'll turn it over to you for kind of like the faith angle of those roots, but wanting to make sure that we understand that this takes a lot of different forms because of a lack of coordination for good reason.
Absolutely. And that's also part of why you will rarely hear advocates describe in detail what conversion therapy looks like, because there are so many different practices. There are so many different forms, because again, nobody's teaching how to do this in any like accredited school of psychology. And while people are unfortunately teaching how to do this in some theological contexts, which actually the guide calls out. The American Association of Christian Counselors having a code of ethics that describes it, and some other organizations hosting materials on what they claim to be teaching how to deal with unwanted same-sex attractions. That's one of the key buzz terms that we hear a lot. There is a wide range. But yes, part of what makes this a useful resource is that we do list off various different terms that we know are used, particularly in these contexts, so that folks can recognize them. If you hear somebody offering therapy to address gender confusion, that should raise a flag in your ears. Unwanted same-sex attraction, same thing. If you are seeing, it's very common for churches to have ministries that address a wide range of sexual issues. Frequently, this is more about pornography, sexual addiction, sexual relationships or experiences that people don't want to have for various different reasons because they're unhealthy or go against somebody's personal code of ethics. And those can be entirely legitimate, but also you can sometimes see buried within those treatments of homosexuality, bisexuality, being transgender as being pathological or disordered in some way. So we call out the various different forms and ways that this can be buried and hidden, whether that is a spiritual director, a therapy ministry out of a church, or those kinds of programs. Not saying that these are always conversion therapy undercover, but saying that maybe if this is something you're concerned about, this is something you go to your church leadership and say, how does this particular ministry treat LGBTQ people? So we give a lot of resources about that to try and raise up just people to ask smart questions and maybe know what they're really hearing when they hear one of these buzzwords.
That's great. That's great. Casey, do you want to take the next one or do you want me to do this?
Let's see. Are there certain ways you have found to describe the ways that conversion therapy affects people in the long run, but besides trauma at large? That question?
Yeah.
I mean, there are lots of precise scientific terms that we can use. We talk about the elevated rates of suicidality. We talk about loss of income, elevated rates of anxiety, depression. And from the Trevor perspective, we like to be precise about what we see and accurate on that. That said, if you think saying trauma is going to maybe turn off somebody you're talking to, as an advocate, I say always boil it down to the short and simple words you might use in explaining something to a child. Say that this causes people to be hurt. This causes people to have bad memories. This causes people to feel alone. And all of that is absolutely true. And it also, I think, really connects with people. Sam, do you have thoughts on that?
I love those. Those were all really, really important. I think also, especially in a QCF context, it's remembering that these lasting effects can affect your faith. So I'm a person who has returned, I would say, to my faith after a lot of hurt and harm and bad memories that came because of conversion therapy in at least a faith background, because I was a missionary child. I left my faith, and that is a long-lasting effect. That is something that is, for many people, can be such a protective factor, can be so community building, can be so important to our immortal souls, right? But there is something to be said that conversion therapy can drive people away from our faith, which is the opposite I think many of us want. So one of the long-lasting effects, along with all the to bring in Trevor, all of those things are really precise and specific. To bring in Sam as a person of faith, I think one of the longest lasting effects will always be a slight mistrust of the people of faith, who I wonder if they're just trying to be nice because they're going to try to change me again. That long-lasting distrust is not great at building community, is not great at building a long, healthy relationship with God. That's bad fruit. That is bad fruit because the tree itself is poisoned. It feels like it is not possible that good things could come from something that has hurt me so badly. I hope that helps a little bit as well.
All right. Next one, I'm going to jump on this because I want to.
Love it.
It's a fun question to answer. Are either of you people of faith? And so is this personal in that way? Or does your passion for it come from a place of an advocate role? Speaking purely as a human being, taking off my Trevor hat for just a second, yes, this is absolutely personal. I am a Christian. Cross is there. And actually, I had the honor of serving on, it was then the Gay Christian Network, what is now the Q Christian Fellowship, board of directors for 3 years. That's part of why I love this organization so much and know its unique role. That said, it is just as much as this is something that is a passion project, and because of my faith, I know how important it is to speak in these communities and to these communities in a way that is authentic and that will resonate. It is absolutely myself as an advocate, and Trevor Hat comes right back on, that knows that if we are truly going to put an end to conversion therapy, we have to do it not just in the courtrooms, not just in legislatures. We have to change hearts and minds. And looking at it after years of working on this and research and seeing what communities are being targeted the most and exploited the most by conversion therapists, it was clear that in the United States, Christian communities are particularly vulnerable and being particularly harmed. And so that was part of why, when we thought about how are we going to address these faith-based forms of conversion therapy that our laws just aren't getting to enough yet, we really jumped on the opportunity to partner with Q Christian Fellowship and to really start the project here. Sam, do you want to jump in?
I do, and I now see exactly why you took the question. It's such a good one. I want to start by saying thank you, Casey, for starting that, because I think it's really important for us to be able to have many hats. You saw Casey taking on and off her Trevor Project hat. It's the same thing for myself as well. Faith is really important to me, but I've, again, felt a lot of times that in the LGBTQ community, there wasn't necessarily a place for me to bring this type of a conversation forward. But we have a resource now. That is so powerful, to not just have it be a personal story and a personal experience and a personal passion, to put on that Trevor hat and say, no, we've partnered with QCF, and this is a way for us to make sure that our faith communities and our LGBTQ identities get to live in alignment, that are not, it is not a Venn diagram of two separate circles, but rather, my friends, one of much overlap. That is powerful. So yes, I am happily a person of faith. You saw the smile that it brings to my faith to be able to say that, especially at a conference like this, where it's actually not the abnormality. But I think there is something really powerful about having a resource that makes it less about your personal passion and more about the reason for what we do. If we're going to save lives, we're going to save lives that are in churches. We're going to save lives that are, wondering if church is right for them. We're going to be saving lives for people who church is not a part of their experience. All of these are important parts of living my faith to its fullest intent. So I really appreciate the question. And yes, Casey and I have a lot of moments where we get to smile at each other, especially now with QCF Project, on, oh, cool, this is really great. That's something that's personal for us, not our professional lives, but our personal lives get to kind of be a little bit more seen and more helpful in this work. So love that question. I do see a quick, go please.
Just to be absolutely clear, we're not saying Trevor is like a-religious or hostile to religion in any way. They're not. Obviously, we were able to do this project. It is just critical to Trevor Project's work that it is known that youth of all faith, no faith, any faith experience are welcome and will find the services they need with us. So just making that clear. And that's why we, started this out by describing Trevor as being a secular research-based organization, because that's kind of what really makes us that's our oomph, that's our power in this document. We rely on Q Christian Fellowship to bring the theology and to bring the stories of survivors and lived experiences. And together we've put together something we think is really pretty powerful. I'll hit one, seems like a simple question, but might be a little bit more in depth. Is there a reason that the language is LGBTQ instead of LGBTQ+? part of the reason on that is just knowing our audience and not wanting to introduce confusion. I have frequently found that when you introduce the plus, it can lead to some really excellent conversations, honestly. You wind up going down the road of explaining, well, that includes people who are two-spirit, who are intersex, who are asexual. And these are important, valuable conversations. But for purposes of a conversation about conversion therapy and change efforts, we wanted to focus in on where we have evidence is one important thing. Our research really focuses in on sexual orientation and gender identity. And getting into the plus, sometimes it gets into areas where we just don't have the same amount of research. So we don't want to confuse folks, and we don't want to say more than we can back up with evidence.
I like that. That's a great, I didn't actually, Casey, I really, welcome to live answering. I was like, oh, that second part is really good. I like that. That's a really good additional part. I always love that. I'll try to answer, at least to start this question, recognizing not the lawyer, but I'll do my best in it, which is, even if someone is an adult, do you think it's possible for someone to actually consent to these change efforts? Because what about power dynamics? Okay, so the major important aspect of this is that adults get to make decisions, and they have a variety of different amounts of information that they have received to make that decision. Power dynamics is when, for example, someone has decided that this person has more information or more money or more power, obviously, as the word implies, to help me make this decision. Now, with the Good Fruit Project and the Trevor Project information, we hope that more adults will know that this could be actively harmful. Little known fact, the Surgeon General has actually openly said that conversion therapy is harmful in the past, not the current Surgeon General, to be very frank. And then, of course, there's also been a variety of major medical organizations who've stepped up and said this is a dangerous, discredited practice. However, you can choose to do dangerous and discredited things because you live in a world, well, for speaking to the US audience, you live in a world where you're allowed to make those decisions. For example, the one that I tend to use right now is Big Macs. You could eat 100 Big Macs in a sitting. I do not recommend it, nor would your doctor. You could do it and make a documentary about it called Super Size Me, right? But you would never allow us to sit a child down and force feed them 100 Big Macs. That's because the power dynamics are so different, and that child cannot understand why it would eat this, and of course would also not understand why, doesn't have the power to give that consent. When you're talking about adults, however, that adult can make that decision. We should tell them, don't eat 100 Big Macs, and we can try to warn them of what the effects of that 100 Big Macs will be, but you're still allowed to sometimes make those bad decisions. Casey, I know that wasn't the lawyer answer, but I hope it at least gave you kind of, that's how I see this consent when it comes to the power dynamics of a professional mental health relationship.
You actually did pretty well, Sam. The question of consent is challenging, and we live in a country that is very much geared towards allowing people to do what they want to do so long as they've been informed and things are advertised to them in a truthful way. So that is primarily, so that's why, as of now, yes, adults can consent to various different practices. And that same freedom that allows people to consent to conversion therapy is also the same freedom people rely upon to be allowed to try the right to try idea in medications that may or may not have been completely vetted yet. So these things are all interrelated, and the law especially has to, if it's going to allow one thing, it's going to have to allow other things that are harmful and bad. That said, we are working really hard to make sure that anything that has a whiff of fraud or deception about it gets punished. And so people have to be upfront about what they're doing and what they're risking. And I am actually seeing that in conversion therapy practices across the country because of the laws we're passing and because people now have a better understanding of it. It satisfies me greatly every time I check out a conversion therapist's website and they include an extensive disclaimer promising me they're not doing conversion therapy. And by the way, please sign this form and don't sue me. That just means every one of those things is a new hurdle that somebody has to pass over before they get to the place where harm happens.
I think that's great.
So let's see, looking at this, do I see this resource being relevant to the discussion in other countries outside of the United States? For example, in Australia, where a number of states are trying to pass legislation. Mostly yes. I think that we erred on the side of being specific because we really wanted to make things concrete and real. So some of the organizations that we call out are United States based, like Restoring Hope Network, et cetera. So those may not apply quite so well in, say, in Australia or some of the European nations. But a lot of the theology, I think, will. When we get into a discussion of what it means for Christian communities to disagree and to have a history of disagreeing, to have a history of apologizing for causing harm, we are a global church and those things are going to be fairly universal. I think in terms of some of the language used, if it isn't directly on point, it may well be similar. I can imagine, for example, in the gender identity context, in the US, I seem to see more of the term gender confusion used. In the UK, it looks a little more like gender critical. So, but you're still going to get the same concept of be on the lookout for keywords and be on the lookout for slick branding.
I love that. I'm going to quick answer one because it makes me really smile a lot, which is Katie has a group in my home state, Kentucky, is trying to end conversion therapy this year. Could I share these resources with them? And thank you so much. Katie, we love Banned Conversion Therapy Kentucky. Actually, the founder of Banned Conversion Therapy Kentucky used to be an intern at the Trevor Project. So you should absolutely share these resources with them. We will also make sure to do so. But it's great to know that your home state is working so hard to end this dangerous and discredited practice. And I think in Kentucky, resources like the Good Fruit Project are going to be really powerful because with a community that has a lot of faith practice, it's going to be important to say laws can only do so much, but this can change hearts and minds. Casey, you can take the next one. I just want to make sure we got that great one in.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I knew you were going to jump all over that. Here's one that speaks to my heart. How do you start a conversation about conversion therapy with individuals and communities that are not receptive to LGBTQ individuals? Have you had experience of people reading this guide who came from this perspective? Second question, yes, actually I did. Part of my work, even before I came to the Trevor Project 3 years ago, my entire career has been built around bridging conversations and talking about LGBTQ lives and needs and issues with conservatives, people of faith. And so while we were in the process of reviewing this, I did actually go to some people who I respect deeply, their opinions, who are deeply rooted in some very conservative communities, and who we have some very deep disagreements. And I did actually share this document with them. Their response to it was, and this is what I wanted to hear, was that while they still disagreed with the outcome of the document, they found it to be a powerful document. They found the evidence to be new, something they hadn't seen before, and they wanted to think about it. And they also found it very respectful, which was something that we were aiming for in this. Every paragraph of this, as the main drafters went back and forth, we frequently found ourselves asking, does this come across as condescending? Does this come across as pejorative to Christians? Will this cause somebody to put the document down? And that was something that we thought about because we wanted people to read this all the way to the end. So that's about the document itself. About how do you start these conversations? There are a couple of different ways that I have found, particularly when you're dealing with some tough audiences. One of them is just knowing, and I almost hate to raise this, but we are Trevor Project. Sometimes opportunities arise out of tragedy. And so if you find yourself in a church that has heard about something like the story of Elena Chen last year, a conversion therapy survivor who died of suicide after experiencing conversion therapy in a faith-based context. That started a lot of conversation. And I know that even in faith communities where LGBT issues are controversial, even in the most conservative faith community, they are worried about this issue of LGBTQ youth suicide. They are worried about homelessness. They are worried about the pain and rejection. So sometimes for some communities, this may be a resource that you keep in your back pocket and say, next time there is a moment where there is an opportunity to have this conversation, this is maybe what you raise up when people are willing to listen because they have seen again the tragedy that is associated with this. You don't have to wait for that kind of moment though. I have also often found that you can just initiate the conversation. It can be something as simple as going to your pastor and saying, you know what, I know our church doesn't do same-sex marriages, but my grandchild just told me they're non-binary. I want them to feel safe in my church. And they might feel safer if they knew that you, pastor, had read this document. Will you read this? So we all have stories and reasons why we care about these issues. And I would just encourage folks to brainstorm what is authentic to you, what is real, and what will resonate. Because even if these faith communities don't yet understand all of who we are, I do believe and have seen it happen that people of deeply conservative and diverging beliefs from me do care about people as humans. And this is ultimately a human issue.
Humanity of it, really important. Another question, and I know we're doing really well on questions, having answered 15 already. I'm really proud of this. Another question is, what can mental health professionals do to further the effort of educating people about conversion therapy and bringing it to an end? We've spoken a lot about the faith practice. It's important to remember that faith practitioners still may have a professional society. So the American Medical Association, the American Psychoanalytic Association, Psychiatric Association, I apologize to the interpreter. That's a lot of associations. But the point being, many of these practices, as Casey mentioned earlier, may have a license. So mental health professionals should call out their peers who are openly advertising a dangerous and discredited practice, because it diminishes the actual professional practice that those mental health professionals are doing. It is important for us to also say that when we're testifying in hearings, like we heard earlier in Kentucky and in states around the country, if you are a mental health professional, and especially if you're a mental health professional and a person of faith, your ability to speak in these hearings, which may now all be on Zoom calls, right, is really important, because it says, I don't want my field and the thing I do, which actually helps people, to be tarnished by the idea that conversion therapy is an actual, appropriate practice. It's not, and I'm using my professional mental health practice to say that it is not. A second piece that you can do as a mental health professional is to provide affirming services. We started this presentation with listing Trevor Project's resources because, as Casey mentioned earlier, some of those tough conversations are not actually able to be completed by you and you alone. Having resources can be really important, can be a way to say, let's go figure out some people who may know more about this, or we can learn more together, right? That's always really, really important. So a mental health professional having affirmative resources, and resources that say, we understand that you're questioning a lot about yourself right now. We understand that the world outside has a lot of opinions about what you should be. What we're going to do in this room is let you figure out how we can keep you safe and healthy. That is affirmative therapy, and it takes a lot of different tactics. I am not a mental health professional, but always knowing like that services like Trevor Space are available, so you can recommend to your clients as mental health professionals, that recommending like, here's a resource that will make the world a little bit easier, right? Those are the things that mental health professionals can do, along with, of course, using their voice to call conversion therapy out. It cannot just be advocates. It has to be the professionals too. That's why we listed all of those organizations, because all of them have made a statement saying conversion therapy is dangerous and discredited. Casey, maybe I also saw a question a little bit up about the APA. So maybe you want to give a little bit about the APA and that new comment. So that might be another helpful part.
Sure. And while I'm doing that, you can do what I was trying to do, which is finding the information for what number to text to join 50 Bills, 50 States through our campaign.
I will put that in the chat, no problem.
So the question is, since the removal of homosexuality by the APA from being considered a mental illness, sorry, that's just a word I'm not going to pronounce right now, have pretty much all of the conversion therapy programs been religious? I wish. The evidence that we have seen, one bit of data that we include in the guide is from the UCLA Williams Institute, showing that 700,000 LGBT adults have experienced conversion therapy, about half of whom experienced it as minors. They also went on to estimate that a certain number of youth who are currently teenagers would experience conversion therapy of different types before they turned 18. And the way those numbers broke down was they anticipated that 57,000 youth would experience conversion therapy from a religious practitioner or ministry. And in 2018, they said 20,000 youth would experience conversion therapy from a licensed professional. So you're looking at roughly about 25% of the conversion therapy happening, what is that? Yeah, somewhere in there, is still licensed professional based. And again, there's going to be a measure of overlap in there as well, that you have these religious ministries that will refer to licensed professionals, and these licensed professionals who sometimes have relationships with these religious ministries that are out there. So we do continue to still see a not large, but significant number of licensed professionals who engage in sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts. And every time this is an entirely reasonable question, and it is one that comes up often when we are advocating for legislation about licensed professionals. Lawmakers say, well, this has been, the APA is known better since the 1970s. Is this still a thing? But in every hearing that we have for this, there's always, more than I would expect, licensed professionals coming out of the woodwork to say, I do this. I don't want you to stop me from doing this. These laws would affect me. So the other thing that's worth noting is it doesn't take a lot of individual therapists to do a lot of harm. They can have a lot of clients.
Love that. That's a great ending, Casey. The next one is also going to be to you. So I'm going to give you a chance to breathe while I answer the question, while I start the question. So could you tell us a little bit more about identifying conversion therapy in a religious community? And how would you situate the Catholic courage in this context? So I know that part of this, as we said in the presentation, is in the Good Fruit Project guide. In the guide, it actually talks a little bit about how to identify it. But maybe, Casey, you want to give just a top level of how you do some of that. And of course, if you want to talk about Catholic and courage.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was the question again? I was reading through questions.
No problem. Sorry. Can you tell a little bit more about identifying conversion therapy in a religious community, and how would you situate Catholic courage? So I know, obviously, as I said, it's based in the guide. The guide has how to identify them, but maybe if you want to give a high level, and then courage, and how would you review courage, knowing that we're a Trevor Project, we're not all in that mission.
Sure.
Yep.
Right, because the challenge is often distinguishing between something that is an actual change effort, as opposed to a religious entity that holds a conservative theology. And that is something that, for purposes of this guide, and for purposes of our work generally, we take pains to be clear about. It's one of those things where, when you're an advocate, the last thing you want is for somebody to be able to accuse you of crying wolf. You don't ever want to be in a situation where you're saying something like conversion therapy that has such evident, scientifically documented harms is occurring every time in context outside of what you have evidence to support. Mm-hmm. So while anti-LGBT theologies as a whole may well be harmful, that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about change efforts. When we're describing change efforts, we are looking at things where you are actively trying to take an individual who identifies as LGBTQ or as in some cases that is as somebody who, you know, is attracted to a person of the same sex. Doesn't even necessarily have to uphold any of the formal labels, but says, I identify as a gender other than how you want to describe me. So you don't need to be that sophisticated in how you're describing it. But any effort to stop that experience of how you are attracted or how you identify or how you experience gender and change that into something that is more consistent with the norms of a community that says men should be this way, women should be this way, never the twain shall meet, and there is nothing in between. So what I'm looking for when I'm calling something out as a form of conversion therapy is that intentional practice or attempt to change somebody. So something like, and that does result in something of a gray zone. When you were talking about folks who say, yes, I identify as LGBTQ, however, I choose to live that out in a different way. I choose to live that out in a way that is consistent with my religious beliefs. Mm-hmm. That may be that does not ring as a change effort. That rings as a different way of living out one's orientation or identity. It's a blurry space, and it is also something that I said, you know, spoiler alert, more is coming. The way this plays out in Catholic context is different than you see in a lot of Christian communities. And I am hoping to see a similar guide where we get to work with specifically Catholic experts to really get into that issue specifically.
Love that. Okay, so I'm going to try to answer the question by Tom. So Casey, if you want to read that last other question, then we'll finish this up. And we'll try to keep our answers a little bit short because I know we want to get done in time and give people a little bit of a break. So I will start. Besides the stat of people who've undergone it were more than 2 times as likely to commit suicide, are there any other hard stats I can share with skeptics to directly show how harmful conversion therapy is? I know people who still think it's possible to change sexual orientation. So the first stat that I always think of is it still happening? Here is your stat that it is still happening. 10% of LGBTQ youth, according to the largest national survey of LGBTQ youth, which is done by the Trevor Project, said that they have experienced conversion therapy. So the first question you may be getting from a skeptic is, it's not still happening. Okay, yes, it is, because we are being told by young people that it's still happening to them. Our partners at UCLA and the Williams Institute say that more than 700,000 people have gone through conversion therapy. So this is not a one-off kind of situation. So that's our first hard stat. It is happening and has happened to more than 700,000 people. Second, we move into it's not hurting anybody. Yes, it is. Those who've gone through conversion therapy are more than twice as likely to attempt suicide. And if you are a transgender individual or non-binary individual, and a young person, and you've experienced conversion therapy, 63%, is it 57? It's 57. I'm sorry. It's 57. I always literally skip. It's the opposite form. Sorry about that. 57% of trans and non-binary youth who've gone through conversion therapy have attempted suicide this year alone. Not in the past, not as a experience, but this year. So it is really important for us to also bring in the 2 times as likely to attempt suicide, but also the more than half, that 57%, shows that it's happening now. That harm is actively seriously considering suicide and attempting suicide is very, very dangerous. And then last but not least, I'll lead into our family acceptance. So because another important part of just it is happening, it is harming us, it is also harming our families. So the Family Acceptance Project has done research that shows that LGBTQ youth who go through conversion therapy are experiencing it mostly coming from a rejecting family. So the family that is rejecting them is not only creating that harm of a lack of family connection, it's also potentially creating this mental health harm of conversion therapy's after effects. So whether it is happening in a home, in a church, or by a professional, it is causing mental health harm and separation from those who we need support from the most. Casey, any other stats you want to make sure we bring in?
I'm not going to throw more stats at folks. I am going to remind them that the last page of the Good Fruit Project resource is actually an entire page of resources and information. So you have the various different stats and evidence of harm that we include throughout the guide itself. But if you want to dive deeper and have more information, all that information is at the last page of the guide itself, or also on the resources page at the website. Saying it one more time, www.goodfruitproject.com. So there's plenty of information out there. You will never lack for ammunition on making that case that conversion therapy is harmful. And so for my last question, you said earlier that instead of using the word trauma, you could say it, quote, hurts people. But what if people say that it doesn't actually physically hurt them? Most of them these days just involve emotional, spiritual, relational manipulation, but not physically inflicting pain. You'll note, we did not actually, in the course of talking about this entire presentation, say that conversion therapy is harmful because of the physical forms of conversion therapy that maybe a lot of people have heard of. Yeah. We did that for a couple of reasons. Not because physical forms of conversion therapy and change efforts don't happen. They sadly still do, though they are rarer than they have been historically. But because we don't want to allow our opposition, people who are supportive of change efforts, to try and divide and conquer and suggest that there are good forms of conversion therapy and bad forms of conversion therapy. That's not just because as advocates we don't want that to be the case or don't want to let them do that. It's also because the evidence doesn't support it. All of the evidence that we have, and especially the most recent evidence that we have, peer-reviewed articles, national surveys, all these things that have been done in the last 5 to 10 years, these are all evidence of harm that comes from conversion therapy when most of the conversion therapy that we know is happening today is talk therapy, is that kind of emotional, spiritual, relational manipulation, as the questioner put it. So don't let anybody tell you that, sticks and stones will break our bones, but words will never hurt us. We have all of the evidence in the world that these words do hurt. And these efforts that are done through the medium of speech do hurt because youth are telling us. They are saying, you know what? I have been having these conversations. I've been part of these small group discussions. I have been sharing out my experiences and my feelings and my pain forever, and it's not changing me. And I feel ashamed because I'm failing. That's what we're hearing when youth contact us. And that is the power of words. Particularly in this context at Q Christian Fellowship, as Christians, as people of the book, we know that words matter. The word matters. And so don't ever let somebody tell you that just because it's not electroshock, it's harmless. It's simply not.
I love that. And that's how we're going to end. I couldn't think of a better way to do it, Casey. Thank you for that. Words matter. We've put a lot of time and effort into this coordination and collaboration and great partnership with the QCF to bring about the Good Fruit Project. And we really hope you will join us in spreading, as Casey said earlier, right, planting those seeds far and wide. This is how we're going to enact great change, and we have been honored to do it with you. Thank you so much for coming to the presentation. We hope you have a great rest of your conference, and we will see you throughout the rest of the conference as it goes on. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great day.